clergy never paid taxes. So by 1789, France was deeply in debt thanks to their funding the American Revolution. Thank you, France. We will get you back in World Wars I and II. And King Louis XVI was spending half of his national budget to service the federal debt. Louis tried to reform this system under various finance ministers, even called for democracy on a local level, but all attempts to fix it failed, and soon France basically declared bankruptcy. This nicely coincided with hailstorms that ruined a year's harvest, thereby raising food prices and causing widespread hunger, which really made the people of France angry because they love to eat. Meanwhile, the king certainly did not look broke, as evidenced by his well-fed physique and fancy footwear. He and his wife Marie Antoinette also got to live in the very nice palace at Versailles thanks to God's mandate, but Enlightenment thinkers like Kant were challenging the whole idea of religion, writing things like, "The main point of enlightenment is of man's release from his self-caused immaturity, primarily in matters of religion." So basically, the peasants were hungry, the intellectuals were beginning to wonder whether God could or should save the king, and the nobility were dithering about eating foie gras and songbirds, failing to make meaningful financial reform. In response to the crisis, Louis XVI called a meeting of the Estates General, the closest thing that France had to a national parliament, which hadn't met since 1614. The Estates General was like a super parliament made up of representatives from the First Estate, the nobles, the Second Estate, the clergy, and the Third Estate, everyone else. The Third Estate showed up with about 600 representatives. The First and Second Estates both had about 300, and after several votes, everything was deadlocked, and then the Third Estate was like, you know what, forget you guys. We're gonna leave, and we're gonna become our own National Assembly. This did not please King Louis XVI, so when the new National Assembly left the room for a break, he locked the doors, and he was like, sorry guys, you can't go in there, and if you can't assemble, how are you gonna be a National Assembly? Shockingly, the Third Estate representatives were able to find a different room in France, this time an indoor tennis court where they swore the famous tennis court oath, and they agreed not to give up until a French constitution was established. So then Louis XVI responded by sending troops to Paris, primarily to quell uprisings over food shortages, but the revolutionaries saw this as a provocation. So they responded by seizing the Bastille prison on July 14th, which coincidentally is also Bastille Day. The Bastille was stormed ostensibly to free prisoners, although there were only 7 in jail at the time, but mostly to get guns. But the really radical move in the National Assembly came on August 4th, when they abolished most of the Ancien Regime. Feudal rights, tithes, privileges for nobles, unequal taxation, they were all abolished in the name of writing a new constitution. And then on August 26th, the National Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which laid out a system of rights that applied to every person and made those rights integral to the new constitution. That's quite different from the American Bill of Rights, which was like begrudgingly tacked on at the end and only applied to non-slaves. The Doromac, as I called it in high school, declared that everyone had the right to liberty, property, and security. Rights that the French Revolution would do an exceptionally poor job of protecting. But as noted last week, the same could be argued for many other supposedly more successful revolutions. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Meanwhile, back at Versailles, Louis XVI was still King of France, and it was looking like France might be a constitutional monarchy, which might have meant that the royal family could hang on to their awesome house. But then, in October of 1789, a rumor started that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain somewhere inside the palace, and in what became known as the Women's March, a bunch of armed peasant women stormed the palace and demanded that Louis and Marie Antoinette move from Versailles to Paris, which they did because everyone is afraid of armed peasant women. And this is a nice reminder that to many people at the time, the French Revolution was not primarily about fancy Enlightenment ideas. It was mostly about lack of food and a political system that made economic contractions hardest on the poor. Now, a good argument can be made that this first phase of the revolution wasn't all that revolutionary. The National Assembly wanted to create a constitutional monarchy, they believed that the king was necessary for a functioning state, and they were mainly concerned that the voters and office holders be men of property. Only the most radical wing, the Jacobins, called for the creation of a republic. But things were about to get much more revolutionary, and also worse for France. First, the Jacobins had a huge petition drive that got a bit unruly, which led troops controlled not by the king, but by the National Assembly, to fire on the crowd, killing 50 people, and that meant that the National Assembly, which had been the revolutionary voice of the people, had killed people in an attempt to rein in revolutionary fervor. You see this a lot throughout history during revolutions. What looked like radical hope and change suddenly becomes the man as increasingly radical ideas are embraced. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Meanwhile, France's monarchical neighbors were getting a little nervous about all this republic business, especially Leopold II, who in addition to being the not holy, not Roman, and not imperial Holy Roman Emperor, was Marie Antoinette's brother. I should note, by the way, that at this point the Holy Roman Empire was basically just Austria. Also, like a lot of monarchs, Leopold II liked the idea of monarchies, and he wanted to keep his job as a person who gets to stand around wearing a dress pointing at nothing, owning winged lion monkeys made out of gold. And who can blame him? So he and King William Frederick II of Prussia together issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, which promised to restore the French monarchy. At this point, Louis and the National Assembly developed a plan. Let's invade Austria. The idea was to plunder Austria's wealth and maybe steal some Austrian grain to shore up French food supplies and also, spread revolutionary zeal. But what actually happened is that Prussia joined Austria in fighting the French. And then Louis encouraged the Prussians, which made him look like an enemy of the revolution, which of course he was. And as a result, the assembly voted to suspend the monarchy, have new elections in which everyone could vote, as long as they were men, and create a new republican constitution. Soon, this convention decided to have a trial for Louis XVI, who was found guilty, and by one vote, sentenced to die via guillotine, which made it difficult for Austria and Prussia to restore him to the throne. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to the guillotine. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, there's nothing. Oh my God, Stan! Gee, that's not funny! Dear Guillotine, I can think of no better example of Enlightenment thinking run amok. Dr. Joseph Guillotine, the inventor of the guillotine, envisioned it as an egalitarian way of dying. They said the guillotine was humane, and it also made no distinction between rich or poor, noble or peasant. It killed equally. You were also celebrated for taking the torture out of execution, but I will remind you, you did not take the dying out of execution. Well, unfortunately for you, France hasn't executed anyone since 1977, but you'll be happy to know that the last legal execution in France was via guillotine. Plus, you always got a future in horror movies. Best wishes, John Green. The death of Louis XVI marks the beginning of the Terror, the best known, or at least the most sensational. In 1815 and 1870, France had a king who was either a Bourbon or a Bonaparte. Now, these were no longer absolute monarchs who claimed that their right to rule came from God. They were constitutional